There's a moment, and I think most people who have ever loved someone stubborn know it, when you look at that person and you realize you've been measuring them with the wrong ruler entirely. Margaret Chen had a ruler. She'd carried it her whole life. It told her what success looked like, what a good husband looked like, what a good life looked like. Numbers on a paycheck, rooms in a house, the kind of quiet comfort that smells like fresh paint and certainty. She married a man who smelled like pine sap and saddle leather. She thought she was settling. She was wrong, but not in the way you might expect. This isn't one of those stories where the humble man turns out to be secretly rich, where the rough exterior cracks open to reveal a gleaming interior of hidden wealth. That's not what happened. What happened was stranger than that, and harder and more real than most things I've been asked to put into words. I'm Elias Whitmore. I keep a field journal, always have, since I was 12 and my grandmother gave me my first leather-bound notebook and told me that a man who doesn't write things down loses half his life to forgetting. I'm a rancher by trade, a wanderer by temperament, and by sheer accident of geography, I was present for the better part of the story I'm about to tell you. I didn't understand what I was watching at first. That, I think, is what made me the right person to write it down. The morning I first saw them, my left boot was full of creek water, and I was in a mood dark enough to pickle vegetables in. I'd been riding the upper ridge of the Sangre de Cristo foothills since before dawn, tracking a missing calf that turned out to be dead in a gully 3 miles east. A discovery that solved one problem and created another, because dead calves in that particular gully meant something was pushing stock from the western timber. And the western timber was where the Jicarilla Apache summered. And the summer of 1887 was already tense enough without adding a livestock dispute to it. So I was wet, I was grim, and I was picking my way back along the creek trail when I heard her. Not a scream, not even a cry. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. A single, compressed sound, the kind a person makes when they're trying very hard not to fall apart in public, and public has become anywhere that isn't their own bedroom. I stopped my horse, old Copperhead, who was just as tired as I was but considerably less irritable, and looked through the cottonwoods. She was standing at the edge of the creek, both hands pressed flat against the sides of her face, like she was physically holding her expression in place. Her skirts were dusty from the trail. Her hair, dark and straight and pinned up in a way that was already losing the battle with the mountain wind, had a strand escaping across her cheek. She was not Apache, was my first thought. Her clothes were Eastern city-made, the kind that cost real money. My second thought was that she was too still. People who are lost move. They scan the horizon, they fidget, they call out. This woman was standing like she'd decided to become part of the landscape and was waiting to see if it would let her. I am not by nature a man who involves himself in other people's private moments. My grandmother's second great lesson, right after write things down, was don't be a vulture about other people's grief. But Copperhead had already rustled a branch, and the woman's eyes cut toward us with the sudden sharpness of someone who's been frightened once today and is prepared to be frightened again. "Sorry," I said, pulling up short. "Didn't mean to startle you. I'm Elias Whitmore. I ranch about 4 miles south of here. You're on public land, so you're not in trouble. I gestured vaguely at the creek. Heard something." She stared at me for a long moment. She had eyes the color of river mud after rain, brown, but with a kind of depth to them, something shifting underneath. Then she lowered her hands from her face, and I saw that she wasn't as composed as she'd been trying to appear. Her jaw was tight. Her chin had that particular rigidity that comes from keeping it from trembling. "I'm Margaret So," she said. "My husband is—" She stopped, started again. "We're camped about a half-mile up. I came down to get water and another stop. I needed a moment alone." So that was an Apache name. Navajo, too, in certain clans, but up in this territory, So was Jicarilla. I'd heard the name in the context of a particular family that had been navigating the reservation boundaries for 2 generations with a degree of stubborn ingenuity that had made them quietly famous among people who paid attention. "Your husband is Luka Tso," I said. Something crossed her face, surprise or maybe relief that she didn't have to explain. "You know him." "I know of him," I said carefully. "Everybody in these hills does. He's the one who rebuilt the old Bear Trail last spring when the floods took out the lower access. Spent 3 weeks on it. Did it alone. He did it with 2 of his cousins," she said, and there was something in her voice, A correction that sounded like it mattered to her, like accurate accounting was a kind of loyalty. "Right," I said. I hesitated. Then, because I couldn't think of a more useful thing to do, I dismounted and sat down on a flat rock near the creek bank and pretended to check Copperhead's left foreleg, giving her the gift of my inattention. Sometimes that's more generous than looking at someone. I heard her exhale, a long, slow exhale like she'd been holding it for days. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure. Is this—" She looked around. At the creek, the timber, the ridge of bare rock above the tree line, the enormous rolling nothing of the mountain sky. "Is this actually a life? Do people actually live here, not just survive here, actually live?" I looked up from Copperhead's perfectly fine foreleg. She was looking at the mountains with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't fear. It wasn't awe. It was something more complicated, the expression of someone who has been told a story all their life and is now, for the first time, standing inside that story and finding that the dimensions are all wrong. "Where are you from?" I asked. "Santa Fe," she said. "Originally Albuquerque, my family." She paused. "We had a shop, fabric and dry goods. My mother was very clear about what kind of life was a good life." She said clear the way people say inflexible. Clear that it involved walls and floors and a roof that didn't move. Clear that it involved a man who came home at the same time every evening and knew what tomorrow looked like. "And then you married Luca Tso," I said. "And then I married Luca Tso," she agreed. "Who is," she said it carefully like she was constructing a sentence in a language she was still learning. "Who is the most competent person I have ever met in my life, and also the most impossible. He knows things. He knows things. He can read weather in the way clouds stack. He can tell you what season a tree was damaged in by the way the bark healed. He knows the names of things in 3 languages, and he can build a fire in the rain." She stopped. "But," I offered. "But he brought me here," she said. "Up into this. He said he had something to show me. He said it would take 4 days. He said bring boots and a blanket and trust him." Her voice had gone flat and dry. "I trusted him. I have been trusting him for 2 years, and my trust and a nickel won't buy me a hot bath and a feather mattress, Mr. Whitmore, which is what I want right now more than I have wanted almost anything." I almost laughed. I stopped myself because it wasn't the right moment, but I wrote it down in my journal later that evening. She said trust and a nickel in the same breath, and somehow that was the most honest thing I'd heard in a month. "How far up is he taking you?" I asked. "He says the old summer camp. His grandfather's above the 2nd ridgeline." She looked up. That's very high." "It is," I agreed. "He says it's worth it." I thought about what I knew of Luca Tso. Not much in the way of personal knowledge. We'd exchanged words twice, maybe 3 times at the trading post in Cimarron. What I knew was his reputation, which was the kind of reputation that accretes around a person quietly, through the testimony of people who aren't prone to exaggeration. He was steady. He was principled in a way that had cost him practical advantages more than once. He had refused to scout for a particular army lieutenant whose treatment of the Hikaria had been. The word people used was rough, which was the word people used in those days when they meant something much uglier and didn't want to say it plainly. "In my experience," I said, "Luca Tso doesn't say things are worth it unless they are." She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at the creek. "I want to believe that," she said. "I do believe that. It's just I grew up measuring life in certain ways. Yards of fabric, bolts of calico, whether the flour bin was full, whether there was enough for winter." She picked up a stone from the creek bank and turned it over in her palm, a river stone, smooth and dark, with a stripe of white quartz running through the center like a seam. "My mother used to say that a woman who lets a man lead her away from comfort is a fool." And my mother she wasn't wrong about most things. Was she right about that one? Margaret Tso closed her fingers around the river stone and didn't answer. I gave her the silence. That was the right thing to do. I could feel it, the way you can sometimes feel the right shape of a moment, even when you can't see it clearly. After a while, she put the stone in her skirt pocket and straightened up and said, "I should get back. He'll wonder." "I'll ride with you to the trail junction," I said, "in case you need a guide." She considered this with the same careful expression she'd used for everything. Then she nodded. We walked, me leading Copperhead, her walking with that contained, economical stride that I'd later learned she'd developed in the shop, navigating narrow aisles between bolts of fabric, never knocking anything over, always precisely placed. I notice things. That's what I do. I noticed the way she watched the ground when it was rough and the sky when it wasn't. The way she touched the bark of a ponderosa pine as she passed it, just her fingertips briefly, the way you'd touch something you weren't sure was real. "My husband has a theory," she said, as we reached the junction where the creek trail met the mountain path. "What kind of theory?" "That people are made of the places they come from, that the land shapes the person, not the other way around. That if you want to understand someone, you have to understand their landscape." She looked up the mountain path, which angled steeply upward through switchbacks and disappeared into dense timber. "He thinks that if I see where he comes from, really see it, not just look at it, I'll understand something I've been missing." "And you're not sure he's right?" "I'm not sure about anything up here," she said. "Which is," she gave a short, almost reluctant laugh, "which is deeply uncomfortable for someone who grew up knowing exactly how many bolts of calico you needed for a slow season." I laughed too that time. "Good luck, Mrs. Tso." She looked at me with those shifting brown eyes. "Do you think it's up there?" she asked. "What he's trying to show me?" I thought about the upper ridgeline, about the old Hikaria summer camps that dotted the high country, places I'd passed through once or twice in the course of range work, places that sat in the landscape with a particular quality of intention, not just campsites, but places that had been chosen over generations with the same care that goes into choosing a name for a child. "I think," I said carefully, "that there are things up there that can't be described going down. You have to go up to understand them." She considered this. Then she thanked me in the formal, precise way of someone who's been taught that courtesy is a form of respect rather than a social nicety, and she started up the mountain path. I watched her go until the timber closed behind her. Then I pulled out my journal and wrote, "She's carrying the wrong ruler. The question is whether the mountain will break it or whether she'll throw it away on her own." I didn't know the answer yet. I saw Luka Tso for the first time that same afternoon at the trail junction where he'd come back down to find her. He was exactly what you'd expect from his reputation, and nothing like what you'd expect from any other measure. Medium height, compact, built like someone who'd spent years doing work that required strength but punished waste. He had a face that didn't give much away at first, the kind of face that's been trained by experience to hold its interior processes privately. He was maybe 32, 33. He carried a canvas pack that looked heavy and moved like it was empty. He saw me before I spoke, of course he did, because Luka Tso was a man who saw things, and stopped at a polite distance and waited, which was the correct and courteous thing to do, and which also conveyed, without any drama, that he was absolutely not concerned about a stranger on a trail. "She went up," I said, nodding toward the path. "I know," he said. "I saw her footprints 10 yards back." He looked at me with a directness that wasn't unfriendly but wasn't performing friendliness either. "Elias Whitmore." "That's right. Your south fence runs to the creek junction. Good line." He said it the way people say things they've simply observed, not the way people say things to make conversation. "I know your trail work," I said. "The old bear stretch." Something shifted in his face, not pride exactly, but the expression of someone who's acknowledged for the right thing rather than a convenient approximation of the right thing. "It needed doing," he said. "Your wife came down to the creek," I said. "She seemed," I considered my words, "she seemed like she was working through something." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the careful precision of a man who has learned to measure what he says because the world has not always been generous about misunderstandings. "She's brave," he said. "Braver than she gives herself credit for. She thinks she's out of her depth because the landscape is unfamiliar. But the depth isn't the landscape. The depth is her." He said it simply without emphasis, like a fact he'd verified and filed. Then he nodded at me, picked up his pace, and went up the mountain after his wife. I stood at the junction for a while. Then I wrote, "He loves her in the way that accurate people love things precisely, and without any reduction of what she actually is." I went home. I thought about them for the rest of the day, which surprised me. I don't generally carry other people's business around in my head. I've got enough of my own. But there was something about the two of them that had lodged itself under my sternum like a splinter, not painful but present. The woman with the ruler she'd inherited. The man with the landscape she hadn't learned to read yet. The calf was dead. The fence needed checking. The evening was doing that thing it does in the high country in summer. where the light turns the color of old honey and everything gets briefly, unreasonably beautiful for about 45 minutes before it goes dark. I fed Copperhead, I ate beans from a can, I went to bed. I dreamed, for reasons I couldn't explain in the morning, about a woman standing on a ridge above the clouds, looking down at a world that was smaller than she'd thought. 3 days later, I was replacing fence posts along the north line when I heard someone on the trail above me. I looked up and saw a figure moving through the timber fast, with purpose, not panicked but close to it. I set down my fencing maul and waited. It was one of Luca's cousins. I knew him slightly, a younger man named Dolly, who had the family quality of moving through landscape like he was part of it rather than a visitor. He was coming toward me specifically, which meant he'd seen me from above and angled to intercept. "You're Whitmore," he said. "I am. Luca's wife needs a doctor." The splinter under my sternum shifted into something sharper. What happened? "She fell at the second crossing. Rock came loose under her and she went down the bank. She's not," he paused, choosing words with care. "She's not badly hurt, but her ankle is swelling and Luca won't come down and she won't let him carry her." "She won't let him?" "She says if she comes down now she'll never come back." Dolly said it without judgment, just reportage. "She says she didn't come this far to turn around." A pause. "She's also crying, but she's still saying it." I looked at my fence posts, then I looked at the mountain. "There's no doctor up there," I said. "No," Dolly agreed. "And she won't come down." "No." "And Luca," I thought about Luca Tso with his precise love and his accurate face. "Luca is letting her decide." "He said she gets to choose," Dolly said, with something in his voice that sounded like both exasperation and deep respect. "He said it was always going to be her choice." I thought about a woman pressing both hands against her face to hold herself together. I thought about a river stone with a white quartz seam, now in a skirt pocket somewhere up the mountain. I thought about the wrong ruler, and what it would mean to keep carrying it versus what it would mean to put it down. "How's the ankle?" I asked. "Swollen, not broken," he checked. He checked. "He knows broken bones," Dolly said matter-of-factly. "Of course he does," I said. I picked up my maul, leaned it against the post, and went to saddle Copperhead. Getting to the second crossing took 2 hours on horseback, and another 40 minutes on foot through terrain that Copperhead declined to negotiate, which said something, because Copperhead had negotiated some genuinely inhospitable terrain in his time, and he had opinions about it. I heard Margaret before I saw her. Not the crying Dolly had mentioned, that apparently had resolved itself, or been resolved, or been firmly packed away in the same internal compartment she used for everything else that was inconvenient. What I heard was her talking. She was having a conversation, in a voice that was tight with pain but absolutely coherent, and as I cleared the last stand of timber and came into the small natural clearing at the second crossing, I realized she was talking to Luca. Not pleading, not arguing, explaining. "The problem," she was saying, her ankle propped on a folded blanket, her back against a boulder, her face the color of someone who's been managing pain for a while and is getting tired of it, "is that I've been thinking about this wrong. I've been thinking about it as an endurance problem, a physical problem. Get from here to there, and if I get there, I'll understand what you want me to understand, and if I understand that then," she paused. "But that's not it, is it?" Luca was crouched in front of her, examining her ankle with the same methodical attention he apparently applied to everything. He didn't look up. "What is it?" he said. "It's not about getting there," she said. "It's about being here. Now, this particular crossing, this particular rock I slipped on, this particular way the light comes through the canopy right now." She looked up at the canopy. The light was coming through in long, tilted shafts, the kind that make the interior of a forest look like a cathedral. This exact moment, which I am never going to have again. Luca looked up from her ankle then. "Say that again," he said. "The moment," she repeated with the tone of someone who's embarrassed to be saying something for the first time that perhaps should have been obvious. "That's what you've been trying to show me, not the destination, the texture of the going." She gestured vaguely at the canopy, the creek, the specific quality of late afternoon in a mountain forest. "My mother's kind of life, she was always managing towards something. The full flour bin, the paid-off shop, the secure winter, always the next thing. This is," she looked at the light. "This is just this." I stood at the edge of the clearing, invisible, irrelevant. And I had the feeling I sometimes get when I've stumbled into a moment that belongs entirely to other people, and that I am witnessing purely by accident and should remember precisely. I wrote it down in my head. I wrote it down on paper later that night. Luca rose from his crouch and sat beside her on the boulder, not touching her beside her, present but not crowding. He said quietly, "My grandfather used to say that there are two kinds of knowing, the kind that lives in your head and the kind that lives in your body." He looked at the same shaft of light she was looking at. "Most of what we're taught is the first kind, what things are worth, what a good life measures out to. How much of what you need." "Your grandfather was wise," Margaret said. "He was stubborn and frequently wrong," Luca said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before, a warmth that was specifically calibrated for her, like a light that worked on a particular frequency. "But he was right about that." I chose this moment to make some noise, stepping on a branch, because walking out of the trees in complete silence when two people are having a significant conversation is, as my grandmother would have said, extremely vulgar. Margaret looked up. Recognition crossed her face, not the startled wariness of the creek, but something more like the expression people have when they see someone they'd quietly hoped might show up. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Dolly said you might want some company," I said, "and I had a piece of jerky and nowhere important to be." I held up the jerky, which was a lie. I'd grabbed it as a prop, because people are more comfortable when you have a reason to be somewhere. "How's the ankle?" "Intact," she said, "bruised, embarrassingly swollen." She said embarrassingly with the precision of someone who finds her own limitations personally insulting. "Can she ride?" I asked Luca. He looked at his wife the way people look at situations they're not going to decide for themselves. "Can you?" he said. "I can," she said, "but I'm not going down." There it was again. I looked at her face and saw it, the thing Dolly had described and Luca had presumably seen for days. Not stubbornness in the negative sense. Stubbornness in the sense of, I have come this far into something I don't understand, and I will not retreat into the comprehensible, not now. It was the expression of someone who has caught a glimpse, just a glimpse, of a different kind of measuring, and is not willing to go back to the old ruler until she's seen where this one leads. "The upper camp is another 6 hours on foot," Luca said to me. "Half that on horse." "Copperhead won't do the last switchback," I said. "He'll do the long approach. The switchback," Luca considered. "I can bring her up from the eastern arm. It's longer, but it's not steep." "That's another 8 hours," Dolly said from somewhere above us. He'd apparently climbed a tree at some point, which I chose not to comment on. "We'd camp twice." "Then we camped twice," Margaret said. Everyone looked at her. She looked back with those river-brown eyes and a jaw that had recovered its full rigidity. "I have enough supplies if someone stops wasting jerky on his horse." I wasn't wasting jerky on his horse, but I looked at Copperhead guiltily anyway, because that's what happens when a woman of genuine personal authority gives you a significant look. "We camped twice," Luca said. He said it simply, in the voice of someone confirming a decision that's already been made. "So we did." The first camp was at a wide shelf of granite above the tree line, where the air had that quality, a quality I'd noticed before in the high country, but had never found words for, of being absolutely clear in a way that made ordinary air seem, by comparison, like you'd been breathing through gauze. You could see the valley floor from there, 1,000 feet below, reduced to a patchwork of pale greens and tans. The creek we'd followed for 2 days, a silver line that looked, from that height, like something a child had drawn. Margaret sat with her ankle elevated on her pack, looking at the valley. I sat a few yards away, writing in my journal, which is what I do when I don't want to disturb a moment but also don't want to leave it. After a while she said, without looking at me, "What do you write?" "Everything," I said. "Things I see, things people say, things I don't want to lose." "Do you lose things easily?" "Everybody does," I said. "Writing is just admitting that you're going to forget and trying to cheat." She was quiet again. Then, "My mother never wrote anything down. She kept it all in her head. The accounts, the orders, the debts people owed her, the debts she owed. She said that writing things down was for people who couldn't trust their own minds." A pause. "She forgot things, of course, but she never admitted it." I thought about the ruler again. About the way certain legacies come down through the generations not as gifts, but as traps. Not because they were wrong, exactly, but because they were right for a particular life, and then got applied to every life, indiscriminately. The way a woman who learned to survive drought will count every drop of water even when the river's running full. What would she think of this? I asked, gesturing vaguely at the altitude, the horizon, the granite shelf above the known world. Margaret's mouth pressed together, not suppressing emotion, processing it. There was a difference, and she was someone who operated largely on the latter. She would think I'd been foolish, she said. She would think I'd let a man take me somewhere impractical for no practical return. She would count the days I'd been away she stopped, from the life she thought I should have. What would she count? Days I wasn't earning, days I wasn't managing, days I wasn't. Her voice changed texture just slightly. Securing. And are you, I said, foolish? She looked at the valley. She looked at the silver line of the creek, so small from here. She looked at the sky, which at this altitude had shifted to a blue so deep it almost had weight to it. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me again when I can see what's at the top. Luca was in camp that evening. He'd gone out in the hour before dusk to check the route for the next day, and came back with a small bundle of something he set to steep in the camp pot, which turned out to be a tea made from plants I couldn't name, slightly bitter, with an aftertaste like cedar and pine resin. He set a cup in front of his wife without comment. She picked it up, smelled it, made a face. Drink it, he said, for the ankle. It smells like a forest. It'll help. How do you know? Because my grandfather used it for 30 years and kept walking until he was 84, Luca said, and then stopped walking because he wanted to, not because his ankles gave out. Margaret drank the tea. She made another face. But she drank it. I watched this small exchange with the attention I try to bring to things that are quiet but significant, and what I wrote in my journal was, he doesn't make things easier for her. He makes them possible. There's a difference that's hard to describe and unmistakable once you see it. That night, sleeping on the granite shelf with the stars so close and numerous they felt like a ceiling rather than a sky, I listened to the sounds of the mountain, the distant percussion of rockfall, the wind through rock, the absence of all the sounds that define ordinary life, and thought about Margaret So's mother, who had lived and died in the security of bolts of calico and a flour bin that was never empty, and who had tried, in the most sincere way she knew how, to love her daughter with the same certainty she'd applied to everything else. I thought about how love sometimes fails forward into the next generation as limitation. I thought about how people carry the shapes of other people's fears in their own bodies, and don't always know it, and sometimes need a great height to see it clearly. Then I went to sleep. The second day was harder. Margaret's ankle had improved, the tea, and Luca's rapping and stubbornness, which is its own kind of medicine. But the terrain steepened on the eastern arm approach, and there were places where I needed Copperhead's strength to haul our supplies, and she needed Luca's arm to navigate the loose shale. She took his arm without comment, which felt like a significant development from the woman who'd been standing alone at the creek pressing her face together. Dolly was scouting ahead. Luca was with his wife. I was with the horse and the packs, and the quiet, manageable pleasure of being useful without being central. At the second rest, a wind-scoured promontory with a view that made vast feel like an understatement, Luca sat beside Margaret and pointed at features of the landscape, naming them in the Jicarilla language first and then in English, and sometimes in Spanish, and occasionally in a fourth language I didn't recognize. He named peaks. He named river bends. He named the particular quality of cloud formation that meant weather was building but still 2 days out. Margaret listened with the focused, economical attention she brought to everything. I noticed she'd stopped pressing her face together. I noticed she'd started asking questions. What's that one? In Jicarilla, the name translates roughly to the place where the sky touches the elk antlers, because of the shape. He traced the outline of a distant peak with one finger. My grandfather named it, or rather, he inherited the name from his grandfather, who inherited it from his. The names have been in use long enough that they're accurate. Accurate, she repeated, like she was tasting the word. The sky does touch there in a certain way, he said. In early spring, when there's still snow, the light hits the high face in the morning and the color is, he paused, searching. There's no word for the color in any language I know. What does it look like? He thought about it for a long time. Like something that shouldn't be possible, he said. Like a color that only exists for about 4 minutes in early March, and then doesn't exist again until the next year. Margaret looked at the distant peak. My mother would say that's not a useful thing to know, she said. No, Luca agreed, it isn't. But you know it anyway. It's worth knowing for its own sake, he said simply. She was quiet, then in a voice that was doing something complicated around its edges. My mother also would have said that about you, not useful, not practical, not what she would have chosen. A pause. She wasn't wrong in her terms. No, he said again, she wasn't. But her terms were, she stopped, started again. Her terms were very small. It was the first time I'd heard her say it directly, not as an accusation, not with bitterness. With something more like the specific sadness of seeing something clearly after a long period of not being able to see it at all. Luca didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers on the rock between them. Not a grand gesture. Not the kind of thing you'd write into a story to make the audience feel something. Just a hand placed over another hand in a particular moment on a particular promontory in the specific quality of light that exists above the tree line in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the late afternoon of early August. I looked away and wrote nothing. Some things you write down later. The upper camp, Luca's grandfather's summer camp, was not what I expected. I'd been expecting, I think, something that would explain itself. A view or a ruin or some particular confluence of geography that would announce itself as significant. That would make the 4 days of climbing feel immediately and obviously justified. That's how I'd been thinking about it, I realized, even as I'd told Margaret otherwise at the Creek Junction. I'd been expecting a destination. It was, from a purely practical standpoint, a natural terrace carved into the south face of the upper ridge, about 30 feet deep and 70 feet wide, protected on the north and east by rising rock and open on the south and west to a view that I'll try to describe it, and I'll fail, and I'll leave my failure in these pages because the failure itself is instructive. You were above the clouds, not looking at clouds on a horizon, not looking at a cloud ceiling from below, above them. The clouds were below the terrace, a shifting, vast, uneven field of white and silver and the occasional deep gray, moving with a slowness that made you aware in a physical way of the size of weather. And above the clouds, above us, nothing but sky. A blue so unmediated it had no business existing. A sky that had, from that vantage, no relationship to the sky you know from the ground, the sky that's a ceiling, the sky that's the top of things. From that terrace, the sky was not the top of anything. It was simply where you were. I stood at the edge for a long moment and felt something I didn't immediately have a word for. Later I wrote it as the sensation of the world being much larger than you'd remembered and the surprising discovery that this felt good. Luca was watching his wife. Margaret was standing at the edge of the terrace with her hands at her sides, not pressed against her face, not folded tightly, just there, open, as if she'd forgot to hold herself in and hadn't yet decided whether that was a problem. She was looking at the cloud field below. Her hair was entirely loose now, the pins had given up somewhere on the second day's climb, and the wind from the west was doing something dramatic with it, which she didn't appear to notice. Her expression was completely unmanaged. I'd never seen her face like that before. In all the days I'd watched her, and I am, as I've said, an observer, not a participant, her face had always had something going on with it. Processing, containing, evaluating. Now it was just present. Open in a way that faces aren't usually open because the world doesn't usually earn that particular openness from a person who's had good reasons to keep it closed. I moved away from them. Not far, the terrace had limits, but enough to give them the distance the moment required. I sat on a piece of old timber that had been shaped, a very long time ago, into something like a bench. The wood was gray and smooth. Generations of hands had worn it. I put my palm flat on it and felt the grain and thought about Luca's grandfather sitting in this exact spot, looking at the same cloud field, naming the same peaks, being exactly as small and exactly as large as a human being can be simultaneously. My grandmother, the one who gave me the journal, used to say that there were places in the world that had memory. Not the memory of humans, which is selective and narrative and self-serving, but the memory of landscape. Rock memory, which is long. Weather memory, which cycles back. The memory of a place that has been returned to generation after generation because it does something to the people who come here that they can't get anywhere else. I thought she was being poetic when she said that. I wasn't sure anymore. Luca spoke first. He said, my grandfather came here every summer for 50 years. In the years when the government was, when they were moving people, taking land, making things very hard. He came here because here is not something anyone can take. They took the valley grazing rights. They took the lower timber access. They drew lines on maps that cut through places that don't understand lines. His voice was completely level. But this, he gestured at the sky, the clouds, the uncapturable view. This doesn't have a deed. Margaret was listening. I was pretending not to. He used to say, Luca continued, that a person who knows where they come from can't be entirely lost, even when everything else is taken, even when the language is a pause. When they try to take the language, something moved across his face that I felt rather than saw, a shadow of something very old and very heavy that he carried with the same practiced efficiency he carried his pack. He taught my father this place. My father taught me. He stopped. Margaret turned to look at him. I could see her profile from where I sat, the precise line of her jaw, the angle of her nose, the particular way her eyes moved when she was listening with her whole body rather than just her ears. And she said, "And I want to teach our children," he said, "but first I needed you to know it." A pause. "Really know it, not in your head, in your—" He put a hand on his own sternum. "Here." The wind moved across the terrace. Below, the cloud field shifted, and for a moment a gap opened in it, a gap large enough to see through down to the valley floor, the creek, the distant brown geometry of the trading post at Cimarron, the long parallel lines of irrigated fields, everything that constituted ordinary life reduced to a small, intricate pattern that looked from this height exactly like what it was. A human arrangement, temporary and specific and no more permanent than clouds. I watched Margaret's face as she looked through the gap. I watched her see it. Here's the thing about moments of realization, and I've seen a few in my years of watching and writing, and every time I try to describe them, I hit the same wall. They are not dramatic. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with music or physical transformation or a line of dialogue that summarizes what just happened. They're quieter than that and more irreversible. They look like a person standing very still, looking at something, and then being someone very slightly different when they turn away. Margaret stood at the edge of the terrace for a long time after the gap in the clouds closed. Then she turned to Luca and said, "We need a bigger blanket." He looked at her. "For when we bring the children," she said. "The granite is cold at night, and if there are children, we need to plan for that." She was already looking around the terrace with an expression I recognized. Not the containment expression, not the evaluating expression, but something new. The expression of someone taking stock. What's here? What do we need? What can be done? The same expression, I realized, as the flour bin and the dry goods shop, but aimed at something entirely different. And a proper camp kit, not just the traveling kit. We should cache supplies so we're not carrying everything up every time. Luca was quiet for a moment. "We," he said. "We," she said firmly. He exhaled, a single long exhale, like a man who's been holding something in careful balance for a long time and has just felt the weight shift to level. Not relief exactly, something more like resolution. "My mother used to bring dried venison," he said, "wrapped in cedar bark to keep it." "That's efficient," Margaret said, in the voice of someone who approves of efficiency in any form. "Show me how." "I'll show you this fall, when we come back." She looked at him then, a look that went between them without any of the edges or careful management I'd watched her apply to everything for 4 days. Just a direct look between two people who have arrived together at the same coordinates. "We're coming back," she said, not a question. "We're coming back," he confirmed. I stayed at the upper camp for 2 nights. I'm not sure even now exactly why. I had a ranch and a dead calf and a fence that needed completing, and none of these problems were resolving themselves in my absence. But something about the terrace had the quality of the bench wood, worn smooth by repetition, shaped by people who'd sat exactly where I was sitting and looked at exactly what I was looking at, and something in me was reluctant to leave before I understood what they'd understood. On the second night, Dolly built a fire in the old fire ring, a ring of stones that had been there so long they'd sunk slightly into the granite, darkened, part of the landscape rather than placed in it. And we sat around it, the 4 of us, and Dolly told stories in the Hikaria way, which is not the way stories are usually told, not with a beginning, middle-end architecture, not with the specific kind of tension and release that makes a story satisfying to a person who learned stories from a certain tradition. The Hikaria way, or at least Dolly's way, which was particular to him and his considerable personality, involved a kind of circularity, a sense that the story was returning to something rather than arriving at something, and digressions that were not digressions but lateral moves, sideways into connected things. The way a river doesn't go directly from mountain to ocean, but wanders through everything the landscape has to offer. Margaret listened with her new expression, the one that wasn't managing. At one point she asked a question about one of the people in the story, what happened to them after, and Dolly paused and said, "They're in the story. When you need them, they come back." He said it as if this were perfectly obvious, and maybe it was. Margaret thought about this for a while. Then she said, "In the stories I grew up with, people either stayed in the story or they left. They didn't come back unless there was a reason." "There's always a reason," Dolly said. "You just don't always know what it is when they leave." She looked at the fire. "My mother left," she said quietly. 2 years ago she died." Nobody spoke. "She never met Luca," Margaret said. "She died before the wedding. She stopped. I watched her jaw go rigid, then release. She never knew about any of this. She had a picture in her head of what my life would be, a particular picture, and I spent a long time," she paused. "I spent a long time trying to either be the picture or apologize for not being it." The fire snapped. "She would have found this impractical," Margaret said. "She would have found it uncomfortable and inexplicable, and she would have worried about me up here above the clouds with the ankle and the cold nights." A pause. "But she loved mountains. She never went to them. She thought she couldn't afford the time, but she loved them from a distance." Her voice had changed again, softer, not compressed, but genuinely open, genuinely uncertain. "I wonder sometimes if she carried things she never let herself go toward, things that were too far from the flower bin." Luca looked at his wife. "Tell me about her," he said. And she did. For a long time, sitting above the clouds, with the fire and the stars and the particular weight of high-altitude air, Margaret So talked about her mother. Not the mother who'd given her the ruler, not the mother whose terms were small, but the mother underneath that. The woman who loved mountains from a distance, who kept everything in her head because she'd been taught that writing things down was for people who couldn't trust themselves, who had built security around her daughter with the most loving and most limiting hands she knew how to use. I wrote in my journal, sometimes the most important story isn't the one happening now. It's the one that was never told before and is finally finding its way out. Dolly listened, Luca listened, I listened. Above us, the stars were doing their usual impossible business. On the morning we came down, Margaret stood at the edge of the terrace one more time. Her ankle had improved enough that she could stand without favoring it. Her hair was pinned again, not in the original precise manner, but in a loose arrangement that was more functional than formal, the kind of hair management that says I've stopped trying to look like I'm somewhere I'm not. She had the river stone in her hand, the one from the creek with the white quartz seam. I watched her turn it over, once, twice. Then she set it down on the old fire ring, carefully in a particular spot, like she was placing something rather than discarding it. "For next time," she said to no one in particular, or to everyone. Or to the place itself. Luca didn't comment. Dolly was already on the path. I packed my journal and my bedroll and went to collect Copperhead, who had spent 2 nights in an attitude of dignified sufferance and was prepared to be reasonable about the descent. The clouds were below us again. The valley was invisible. We went down through them, into them, through the wet and gray of the cloud layer, which lasted for about 200 feet of descent, and then cleared into the ordinary mountain air below, the air that smells like pine and rock and the animal ordinary of the living world. And then we were below the clouds, and the valley was visible again, laid out ahead of us, the creek and the trails and the trading post and the fence line I needed to finish. At the trail junction, the same junction where I'd pointed Margaret upward 4 days ago, she stopped. She looked up the mountain. The clouds were visible from below, a solid gray-white ceiling, impenetrable, not hinting at what was above them. "I know what's up there now," she said. "That's the thing, I know what's on the other side of that." She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. I finished my fence that week. I checked on the matter of the dead calf and the predator pushing stock from the western timber, which turned out to be a mountain lion operating out of a particular drainage, and which resolved itself without requiring any dramatic intervention. I wrote my journal. I filled 2 more notebooks that summer. I saw Luca and Margaret so twice more before the end of the season, once at the trading post, once on the creek trail, where they were walking together in the comfortable silence of people who have run out of territory to be strangers in. Margaret had a notebook of her own by the second occasion. A small one, brown leather, carried in her skirt pocket alongside the second river stone she'd picked up somewhere. I didn't ask about the notebook. I didn't need to. Some things you start writing down because you finally trust that the life is worth keeping. The last thing I wrote about them, in the final pages of that summer's journal, was this. She came up with the wrong ruler and she left it at the top. Not dramatically, not as a grand renunciation. She just set it down on the fire ring, next to a river stone with a white seam through the middle, in a place that doesn't have a deed and can't be taken, and she came down through the clouds with her hands open. Luca was right. She was braver than she knew. She just needed a mountain to show her what her bravery was actually for. I've thought about that terrace often in the years since. I've thought about the way the cloud field looked from above, the specific quality of that wrongness, the world being below you instead of above, everything you'd ever treated as ceiling suddenly being floor. I've thought about Dolly's firing stories and the way people come back in them when you need them. I've thought about a woman who loved mountains from a distance and never went to them, and the daughter who went for both of them. Mostly I've thought about the bench wood, the gray, smooth, generation-worn bench on the granite terrace above the clouds in a place that doesn't have a deed. There are things that can't be taken. There are things that are worth knowing for their own sake. There is a color on a distant peak in early March that exists for about 4 minutes that has no name in any language.